Hello and welcome. This lecture is going to be looking at two events, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, as well as the Bread and Roses strike, and I've included both of them because they're important events that occur that lead to some change, and well, one leads to some change and one doesn't. And we're going to be looking at this. I'd like to add in this is at the end of the Gilded Age into the Progressive Era. And from 1880 to 1900, there are 37,000 strikes that occur. And when people talk about how evil unions are and how terrible like striking is in general, we've kind of forgotten the past and how necessary it was, particularly in this period. Working conditions were brutal in these factories, and it was just about corporations. There were bombings that happened at this time because people were frustrated at the fact that nothing was happening, and the treatment of workers was appalling. In 1900, hundreds of thousands of people were working without a union. Most people worked six days, if not 7 days a week, for at least 16 hours, in many cases 12 to 16 hours. And just to understand, with those workers, a third of all miners who worked were in poverty status. So these most of the people that worked in these various fields were in appalling conditions. Their life expectancy went down quite significantly. They were literally cogs in the wheel. So we're going to be looking at one disaster and one strike in this. So the Triangle Shirt Waist Factory Fire, and this happened on March 25th, 1911, at the Triangle Shirt Waist Factory in New York City, and this happened close to closing time. And what ends up happening is a fire breaks out because of a rag that was put into a trash bin, and it ended up due to some sparks that happened, sets the factory on fire. And this factory, is important to note, was on the 8th, ninth, and 10th floors of this majority of workers were. And these were young Italian and Jewish women. And the people on the 8th, ninth, and 10th floors were trapped. Others were able to escape. Women tried to escape, but the doors were locked. There were no fire extinguisher systems, and all the buckets of water that were intended to prevent a fire were empty. Many of the women tried to escape by the fire escape, but it was rusted, and when it was so overloaded by people, it ended up collapsing, and so women died that way. A lot of women made it to the roof if they could, or to the nearest windows, and fearing escape and fearing that they couldn't escape and that they were going to be engulfed in flames, end up jumping off the roof or through the windows. Within 18 minutes, 46 young women out of the 500 workers were dead as a result of this fire. Firefighters and other people were appalled. One person said the street was just mangled with bodies, and that it was one of the most horrific sights they had ever seen. People were just walking home from work and saw women jumping to their deaths. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union proposed an official day of mourning, and the grief-stricken city gathered in churches and synagogues and in the streets trying to figure out what happened. So protests end up being voiced during this time. People are angry and upset. They're wondering what happened and why this wasn't prevented, because this was a preventable disaster. People began to ask for justice and wanted safeguards to protect the vulnerable and the oppressed. People wanted to have safer working conditions and stops, because not only fires were very deadly for people within the factories, but also fires could spread very easily and result in mass casualties, as seen in the Great Chicago Fire. So people were really were calling outrage, and because these were young women dying, it was seen from both sides of the party spectrum, and from the unions, and even the conservative anti-unionists wanted change. So the workers flocked to Union quarters to look for testimonies and mobilization, and they demanded that the Triangle Shirtwaist factory owners, who were Isaac Harris and Max Blanc, be brought to trial for their negligence. And it was a very powerful, organized unions that were bringing up the case, and they were trying to save safeguards. And so on April 11th, a grand jury indicted both Harris and Block on 7 counts, charging them with manslaughter of the second degree under the Section 80 of the Labor Code, which mandated that doors should not be locked during working hours. So on December 27th of the same year of 1911, a jury acquitted Block and Harris from any wrongdoings, determining that they had no idea if the doors had been locked or not. So as a result, people were dissatisfied by this. So 23 individual civil suits were filed against these owners and the owners of this building. So on March 11th, 1914, 3 years after the fire, Harris and Block end up settling out of court for $75 per person lost, which sounds like a lot, which is a lot of money, but compared to their profits, it was really not. Now, they started a new factory, a new Triangle Waist shirt factory, and what ends up happening upon inspection of this new factory, they find that it's not fireproofed, there are no fire escapes, and there wasn't adequate exits in this new building. On August 1913, Block was charged for locking doors of his factory during hours. A judge ended up fining him $20 and then apologized for fining him for that at all, just to understand kind of some of the judgments of the day. So on December 13th, the new factory, upon inspection, was littered with enough rubbish that was piled 6 feet high, with scraps that are kept in non-regulation flammable wicker baskets, the same kind of baskets that started the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory of 1911. And this time, instead of having a court appearance or even a fine, the judge gave them a stern warning to fix the problem. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory ended up ceasing operations in 1918, and the owners maintained through that their factory was the model of cleanliness and sanitary conditions, and that it was second to none in the country. So although the incident has great significance of the day because it brought a lot of people to try to enact change, and what ends up happening 3 years after the 1911 fire, that 36 new law codes were enacted within New York City to try to stop people of this. But this horror, as terrible as it was, this fire in itself, ends up resulting in not a lot of change in the legal system. It still favored factory owners, no matter what the sanitary conditions were. And this really brought to light the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the inhumane working conditions that people were in. Now we're going to take a moment and look at another incident that happens, and this is known as the Bread and Roses strike. So the Bread and Roses strike began on January 1st. It began January 1st, 1912, and this is in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And what ends up happening is at this time, a law is passed decreasing the number of hours for women to work to 54 hours a week. Just understand we have a 40-hour week, so that's still 14 hours more for most people who have a 40-hour week. So this is still a lot of hours. So they decreased to 54 hours. Employers were complying with the law, but as they did so, they reduced the pay to compensate for the lost hours of work. So it ended up to being about 32 cents a week. Now, when I said in the lecture of the Chinese Exclusion Act that the Chinese did not work for $1, it was $1 for a month. This is 32 cents a week. Okay, so 10,000 workers from the end up coming, and this is known as the Bread and Roses strike. 10,000 workers come out, and the owners were divided too. Some of them were divided, but a lot of them had a tense standoff with these workers. And so what ends up happening is the workers appeal to the IWW, which is the International Workers of the World, or also known as the Wobblies. And they appeal and try to say, hey, we need better working conditions, and they have cut our pay as well. Employers beg the governor to reply, and what he ends up doing is sending in the militia. So dozens were arrested for charges that they had committed murder, even though that wasn't the case, and a lot of them were arrested for picketing. On February 10th, the strikers put 110 children on a train to New York City. Again, most of these workers are women. So they put their children on the train to show that that these children are being underfed, and that this is a way of showing their plight in a real physical way, is to show the health of their children. So they put them on a train, send it to New York City, and these children are greeted by a crowd of 5,000 in the Grand Central Terminal. And after the train load arrived in Lawrence, following week, the children were paraded down Fifth Avenue of like, look at the children of workers. And one nurse even replies, or comments at the time, that they'd never seen such emaciated children. This is what is known as the children's exodus. At this time, there's many children exodus, but this is the children's exodus of this period in the United States. So this is known as the children's exodus, and it was a public coup for the strikers, and Lawrence authorities ended up putting a halt to it. So on February 17th, they were going to send another train full of children, and the mayor said no more children or women could leave the city. 3 days later, families tried to bring 46 children bound to Philadelphia train station. On February 24th, the city marshal ordered them to disperse. When the defiant mothers tried to get their children aboard on the trains, police dragged the women from the trains by their hair, beat them with clubs, and arrested them in front of their horrified children, who were screaming and looking on with tears. Also at the time, they were beating children, children were brutally assaulted as well, trying to help their mothers. So this is the turning point in the strike. This brought national visceral reaction against the company workers and for the Bread and Roses strike. President Taft asked the Attorney General to investigate, and Congress began a hearing on the strike on March 2nd. Striking workers, including children, many of whom had dropped out of school by the age of 14 and were working in these factories, end up getting before Congress in describing these terrible working conditions inside the Lawrence mills. A third of it is important to note, a third of these mill owners had a life expectancy less than 40 years. I talked about in the Industrial Revolutions in Manchester, and particularly it was 19 years. So this is still very young. If they did not die, often they died of slow, complicated respiratory illnesses such as pneumonia or tuberculosis from inhaling so much lint and dust all the time. They also talked about how many limbs and lives were taken by these factories. And one of the most poignant examples that are given at the time is by a 14-year-old girl named Camilla Tolley, who shocked lawmakers by accounting how a mill machine had, when her hair got caught in it, her scalp had been ripped off, and she was hospitalized for 7 months without pay, and was subsequently fired as a result of this work injury. Children after children began testifying, many teenage girls in front of Congress, and the public tide began to go in favor of the strikers. The mill owners who were ready for a deal agreed to the workers' demands. The mill owners were ready for a deal, agreed to the workers' demands, and the two sides agreed to a 15% wage hike, a bump in overtime compensation, and a promise not to retaliate against the strikers. On March 14th, the 9-week strike ended with 15,000 workers gathered on Lawrence Commons shouting the agreement to the offer. There was only 5 people who sounded their dissent out of the 15,000. And so this is a big victory in labor history, because not only did these women give themselves agency in many ways by using their children as voices, but they were able to testify within Congress of their wages and of real working life to many people who had never known what goes on inside of factories. And this is really when you get, for the first time, people going away from supporting the big corporations. There's many other examples as well, and really citing for the strikers. And this is why when everyone talks about removing regulations and how dangerous unions are, these unions were fought for a particular reason. And with big corporations, including corporations in the 19th century, as are now, it's generally assumed that people are going to do good for the sake of doing good. However, in many cases, that is not the case. So the reason why we have these laws of regulation of hours and wages and workman's comp and also retirement, and these things are were negotiated by unions. And so there's a big push right now to go anti-union, very much so in education. There's a Supreme Court just ruled that you didn't have to be, that the union did not, if you're not part of the union didn't have to work for your benefit. And as a result, right now there's a big push to remove teachers' unions. Teachers' unions is just one option. You also have miners' unions and other unions. A lot of them have been removed. Airline unions were removed in the 1980s under Reagan. And we'll talk about that when we get to the 1980s. He ends up firing 11,000 people to prevent a strike from happening. And so it's very important to note that these that unions had a specific role, that they were trying to fight inhumane working conditions, and to this day, it is easy for larger corporations to stop unions rather than unions actually stopping them, but at least people have a say. And it's if we get very pro-company and pro-corporation, as we do this, it's going to limit workers' rights. And it's really important, whether you believe, whether you side on one political spectrum or another, that maybe the conditions of working people is something to fight for. And that these unions were valid, particularly in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. So I hope you enjoyed learning about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, as well as the Bread and Roses strike.